Good morning, and welcome to this third presentation on a very important topic, truth and reconciliation. I presented 2 lessons last year, and following those lessons, some of the student feedback indicated that you wanted to learn a little bit more about the role of our church and what the church is doing on the topic of truth and reconciliation. So that'll be the focus today. But for the benefit of our new students, including grade 8s, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on review, just so that we all dial back into what this is all about. So what will we learn today? We're going to review what residential schools were and who they were for. We will review the legacy of residential schools and the related concerns. We will review the significance of Orange Shirt Day and the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And then we're going to learn about some of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action for our church. Now, why is it important for us to know this? We have a responsibility as citizens or residents of Canada to be aware of our nation's history, including the events which we might be less proud of. We need to ensure that we are aware of the harm that has been done to our Indigenous peoples and the need to rebuild our relationship with them. And as students of a Catholic school, we need to be aware of our church's involvement in residential schools and what our church is currently doing on the topic of truth and reconciliation. So what were residential schools? This was a network of boarding schools across Canada for Indigenous children, First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. It was mandatory for these students to attend at a certain age. The boarding schools had the students attend classes during the day, and then they would sleep there at night. They would not go home. In fact, many of these residential schools were purposely built far away from Indigenous communities to separate the children from their families. The first residential schools were established with passage of the Indian Act back in 1876, and the last ones closed in the late 1990s. The legacy of residential schools in Canada, we now know that this system inflicted significant harm upon Indigenous people in Canada in several different ways. First of all, by removing children from their families at a young age, by depriving them of their ancestral language and culture. They were not allowed to speak their native language at these schools, and they were not allowed to celebrate their culture. The schools were overcrowded, they were underfunded, there were poor health and safety standards, poor nutrition, and there were a lot of health concerns. And most importantly, many of the students were exposed to physical, psychological, or sexual abuse at the hands of staff and other students at the schools. One of the residential schools was located on the site now occupied by our staff parking lot. This school was a little different in that it was located very close to the First Nations community on the North Shore here. It was a 3-story wood frame building with classrooms on the first and second floor and a dormitory on the top floor. Approximately 2,000 students attended between 1899 and 1959. This view is looking northwest, and the trees in the background are where our old school building currently stands. Tomorrow, you're going to be invited to wear an orange shirt above your uniform. And if we're going to do that, we should understand the significance of that action tomorrow. Orange Shirt Day started 9 years ago when, at a residential school reunion, a survivor by the name of Phyllis Webstad told her own personal story of how her grandmother had purchased a new orange shirt for her, which she proudly wore to school. When she arrived at school, the shirt was stripped away from her, and she never saw it again. The other survivors at the reunion designated September 30th as a date for students across Canada to wear an orange shirt to school in memory of the victims of residential schools. The date chosen was the traditional date each year when Indigenous children were taken away to residential schools. In 2019, a private member's bill was introduced in the House of Commons to make Orange Shirt Day a national statutory holiday. This was in response to one of the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The bill received royal assent in June of 2021, and we celebrated our first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation in September of last year. This year will be the second. Here are some pictures of Phyllis, both when she was in school and present day. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established in 2008 to investigate the history of the schools and their lasting legacy. The Commission traveled across Canada to collect the testimonies of people who had been affected by the residential school system. Approximately 7,000 Indigenous people told their stories. The Commission concluded in 2015, and it published a 6-volume report which contained 94 separate calls to action. These calls to action were directed either towards governments or towards churches that had been involved with residential schools. The calls to action are recommendations to ensure that all Canadians, including you and I, are educated and made aware of the residential school system and its lasting legacy. Many of these calls to action have yet to be fully implemented. Here are some pictures from the final day of the report when it was released. In the lower right-hand corner, the picture shows the unveiling of the 6 volumes. The gentleman in the center is Murray Sinclair, who chaired the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So in response to student questions from last year, I would like to take a look with you at the 4 calls to action which are addressed to the churches that were involved in the residential school system. The first one is directed specifically to the Roman Catholic Church. Number 58 calls upon the Pope to issue an apology to survivors, their families, and their communities for our Church's role in the abuse of the children in the Catholic-run residential schools. It called for that apology to be delivered by the Pope and for it to be delivered here in Canada. And many First Nations people, Inuit and Métis, said that the apology really needed to be made by the Pope here in Canada. In 2009, Pope Benedict met with Chief Phil Fontaine of the Assembly of First Nations and issued a formal apology on behalf of the Catholic Church in Canada for the abuses in the residential schools. However, that meeting occurred at the Vatican. Finally, this year, in July of 2022, Pope Francis came to Canada and he issued a formal apology on behalf of the Catholic Church for its role in the various abuses of children in the residential schools. Coming to Canada and presenting the apology in person here on Canadian soil effectively fulfills this call to action. And here's a photograph of the Pope in Canada this past July on the day that he gave the apology. And seated to his right is Deacon Rennie Nahaney of the Squamish Nation, who came and spoke to you last year on the day before Truth and Reconciliation. The second call to action for churches is number 59. It calls upon church parties to the settlement agreement to develop ongoing education strategies to ensure that their respective congregations learn about their church's role in colonization, the history and legacy of residential schools, and why apologies to those students, their families, and communities are necessary. So I know in my own parish and in parishes across Canada, they are currently engaged in fulfilling this call to action. We now see territorial acknowledgement plaques outside churches. There have been presentations to parishioners on the history and legacy of residential schools, and we are now seeing the regular inclusion of prayers of reconciliation during the intentions and liturgies throughout the year. So this call to action is being fulfilled on an ongoing basis by the Church. Call to action number 60 calls upon leaders of the church parties to the settlement agreement and other faiths to develop and teach curriculum for all student clergy on the need to respect Indigenous spirituality in its own right, as well as the history and legacy of residential schools and the roles of the church parties in that system. Now, this call to action specifically addresses something that happened both in the initial contact with Indigenous people and ongoing during settlement and colonization, where Christianity was forced upon the Indigenous children in the schools in place of the Indigenous spirituality which they already had. Our Catholic Church has implemented some curriculum changes for those who are studying for the priesthood, and efforts are underway to respect Indigenous spirituality. One notable example is the recent establishment of a Catholic Mass in the Squamish language at nearby St. Paul's Church. The fourth call to action for churches calls upon church parties, in collaboration with survivors, to establish permanent funding in 4 areas: for healing and reconciliation projects, for culture and language revitalization projects, for education and relationship building projects, and for dialogues for Indigenous spiritual leaders and youth to discuss their spirituality, self-determination, and reconciliation. There's not a lot of information on the extent to which this call to action has been implemented, but I do know that the Catholic Church has implemented various fundraising campaigns in parishes across Canada, and our Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops have promised to raise the sum of $30 million for reconciliation-related efforts over 5 years. We also know that there are many efforts underway in schools to implement language revitalization projects. There's a huge effort underway right now to try and preserve these languages which are in danger of being lost due in large part to the residential school system. I would like to draw your attention to another call to action which is going to impact you during your time at our school here. Call to action number 62 calls for mandatory age-appropriate curriculum on residential schools and related Indigenous issues, in consultation and collaboration with survivors, Aboriginal people, and educators. Now, education is largely a provincial jurisdiction, so the provinces have been responding to this call to action with efforts to implement some curriculum. The province of British Columbia has implemented a requirement for all students to take a course in either grade 11 or grade 12 focusing on First Peoples issues. Our school is implementing a new course this year titled English First Peoples 11, which all students passing through STA will take during their grade 11 year. This course is being taught by Mr. Slavinsky, and it will include reading and composition on Indigenous issues. Now, if we're going to take a day off school on Friday, it's important that we know why and who we are honoring with that day off. Call to action number 80 calls upon the federal government, in collaboration with Aboriginal peoples, to establish as a statutory holiday a national day for truth and reconciliation to honor the survivors, their families and communities, and to ensure the public commemoration of the history and legacy of residential schools remains a vital component of the reconciliation process. So when the government declares a statutory holiday, it is to commemorate the history and legacy of residential schools and to honor the survivors of those schools and their families and their communities. So this is what we should be keeping in mind on Friday. The federal government chose Orange Shirt Day on September 30th as the day, and it was first observed last year on September 30th, and we will observe the second one this Friday. Now, this day is in addition to an existing National Aboriginal Day, which is marked every June 21st, but that's not a holiday, it's simply a designated day as a National Aboriginal Day, and that typically comes when we are writing our June exams. I would like to conclude this morning's presentation by introducing to you your guest speaker for tomorrow's assembly. For some time, I've wanted to provide our student body with an opportunity to hear directly from a residential school survivor, from somebody who actually attended a residential school. For tomorrow's assembly, I am pleased to welcome Mr. Stuart Gonzalez from the Squamish Nation. His Aboriginal name is Sempulyan. Mr. Gonzalez was sent to St. Augustine's Residential School in Sechelt at the mandatory age. When that school closed, he transferred to public school in Vancouver and then on to St. Thomas Aquinas High School, from which he graduated. So he is a graduate of our school. Last year, Mr. Gonzalez was elected as a general councillor for the Squamish Nation. The council is the governing body of the Squamish Nation, which looks after all of its affairs. So I hope you will welcome him to our school tomorrow, and I hope that you will enjoy hearing his story, and you will have the opportunity to ask him some questions at the end of the assembly. So I would like to thank you for listening and for learning this morning. You will have in front of you an assignment relating to this presentation, which you can now work on to complete. You can hand it in to your teacher today if it has been completed, or you can hand it in at the next advisory class, which I believe will be next month in October. So thank you and have a great day, and I will see all of you at tomorrow's assembly. Bye.